Right, we're going to get started. A very warm welcome to all of you for the OECD Forum 2014. This is, of course, our session on the sharing economy. My name is Maitri Sitharaman, and I will be your moderator for this session. Before we go any further, I would request everyone to take out their smartphones or whatever digital device you have. I'm going to quickly run you through Assembly. This is your opportunity to participate in this particular conversation. I encourage you to send as many questions as you want, along with the comments, of course, but the questions are absolutely key to this panel. It is an interesting topic, to say the least, and a lot of people, of course, talk about it, but what does it actually mean is the biggest question I have. So I'm guessing you have far more technical questions, so they're completely welcome. Basically, all you need to do to use Assembly or tweet with the session's color-coded hashtag, so that your questions and your comments will show up on the screen up there, and also on the tablet that I have with me. Basically, to make sure that we receive your message, use the hashtag designated for the room, which is based on the color of the room. In this case, it would be hashtag OECDgreen. And basically, what you have to do is check the package that you have on your chairs, and that will run you through the instructions on how you can use Assembly. In the meantime, we were just having this conversation, collaborative consumption, asset-light lifestyle, peer economy, many, many names, but the most commonly used one would be the sharing economy. You can call it what you like, but it is growing, and the evidence, of course, is there for us all to see, especially when you start finding regulators, tax collectors, and big companies start sniffing around a model that is being embraced by millions around the world. But is the sharing economy as democratic as it's made out to be? How is the model evolving? You could not find a better panel than this to discuss. Let's introduce you to the panel very quickly. April Rinne is an expert on the sharing economy, its relevance to cities, policies, and nonprofits. She looks at the big picture, how the sharing economy can transform everything from public policy to global development. She's a young global leader at the World Economic Forum. She heads the sharing economy working group there. And most recently, of course, was the chief strategy officer at Collaborative Labs, where she was advising governments and companies on the sharing economy. Mariana Mazzucato is chair of the Economics of Innovation at the University of Sussex. Her research focuses on the relationship between financial markets, innovation, and economic growth. She's been called everything from Ed Miliband's ideas guru to one of the three most important thinkers about innovation. I do want to point this out. Dr. Mazzucato's new book, it's got rave reviews. It's on the 2013 Books of the Year list of the FT, the Forbes, and also of the Huffington Post. It's called The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Private versus Public Sector Myths. She's going to be presenting the book right after this session at 12:15 this afternoon at the Forum Discovery Lab. Mr. Sang-Woo Kim, we're honored to have you on the panel. He is President of Corporate Affairs at Samsung Electronics Europe. Mr. Kim has managed Samsung's global legal affairs, including regulatory matters, and of course, in another life, interestingly, he's been the long arm of the law as a public prosecutor in South Korea, in charge of everything from criminal, white-collar, to organized crime. William Saito, again, honored to have you on the panel as well. He's the man who's been named by Nikkei as one of the 100 most influential people for Japan. He's also, of course, been EY's Entrepreneur of the Year, a world authority on encryption, cybersecurity, and a special advisor to the Cabinet Office for the Government of Japan. He's also, of course, in the VC consultancy business, advising on innovative technology. And Fred Mazzella, last but not the least, because this is the man who dreamt, created, and faces the very issues every day that we're going to discuss. He's the founder and CEO of BlaBlaCars. He's one of the pioneers in Europe in the ride-sharing community. 7 million members, as he told me, with 1 million transported a month. Big, big numbers there. Let's get started. The first obvious question would, of course, be, is the sharing economy, ladies and gents, all that is made out to be? Is this more hype Or is the reality as strong as people make it out to be? Fred, why don't we get started with you?
Hello, everybody. I think there is a ground for something which will last, but as often there is also lots of fog around it. So there are some real things which are the fact that we have lots of very expensive assets which we don't really use very well, like cars and houses. We don't use them as we could. And so those assets can be shared, and there is a real movement behind it. But then, of course, when we go beyond that and we think that we can share everything, it may not be the case. Like we may not share we may not share everything we have, or it may not be worth sharing everything. So it's a tendency. It's the fact that with the internet connections and with the worldwide networks we have the possibility to put in contact people who can share resources, but we cannot share everything. So we should share the most valuable assets.
April, your thoughts?
Thank you, and delighted to be here as well. By and large, I agree with Fred, where if you think about it, and many of you probably in the room know, we all inherently know, there's nothing new about sharing. But when we think about what we can do with technology, it opens up a universe of new possibilities, being able to share different kinds of assets with people halfway around the world, which wasn't practicable for many reasons previously. But at the same time, I don't see that we are going to rush into a world in which everything is shared. There are lots of things. I still own things, lots of things. And really, we've done quite a systematic analysis of the kinds of assets that are most likely to be shared. For instance, as Fred mentioned, those assets with a high value and low frequency of use. Those are just ripe for being shared. And if you think about it, today we've really only touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of the kinds of spaces, the kinds of assets, the kinds of stuff, if you will. And also, if you think about skills as an asset, that too, we've barely begun to scratch the surface of the value that we can unlock by sharing some of these assets. But there will be natural limitations, both due to practicalities and transaction costs, but also due to things like cultural differences and sentiments around sharing, and obviously a large driver of that as well is trust.
Sang-woo.
안녕하세요. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be invited to this discussion today. And if you ask, the sharing economy lives up to the hype, I would say it is doing more than that. I don't think the connectivity is a goal in itself, but the reason why the connectivity is important is that we become happier when we connected. I would like to give you just a simple 3 example. My daughter is studying in the United States, but I can see what she had as a dinner yesterday. She sent me a photo of duck breast, looking very delicious, and I wrote a note. Honey, I'm very glad you had a nice dinner, but please exercise at least 30 minutes on the treadmill. This kind of small talk really makes me happy, happier than anything else. Secondly, you can stay healthier when you are connected. I take a regular checkup every year, but sometimes I need to extra test. And after 1 week boring waiting, what I heard from the doctor is that, congratulations, you are still okay. Just the simple words. But in the very near future, we don't have to wait 1 week, because thanks to the wearable devices and all those sensors, which provide the more real-time feedback. And thirdly, you can find more opportunities. I think the most important thing for everybody to live happily is to find a job, what they really want to do. The connectivity provides much more opportunities, and it creates a lot of jobs. So in conclusion, I definitely agree that connectivity, the sharing economy will benefit everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariana.
Right. So in terms of sharing, I mean, I think the question is that, sharing is not the end in itself, right? So, the mafia does a lot of sharing. Even when they're in prison, they're somehow able to communicate with people outside. So I don't see that as the end. I see that as a means to get to something much bigger, which, it's sort of the stuff that's on that wall there, which is growth that is smart, so innovation-led, growth that is more inclusive. Piketty's new book shows us that growth has not been inclusive, and growth that hopefully will be sustainable. And to me, that in some ways should be the focus of the conversation, because sharing in and of itself, again, whatever. And my problem is that what I'm seeing in terms of those three things, smart, inclusive, sustainable growth, and how the word sharing has been used in order to describe how to get there, is in fact lots of hype. Why? Because things are actually just getting worse. And what I mean by that, if you think of sort of two areas, one, innovation itself, we are increasingly, I would say since the 1980s, closing down science. We are not sharing. We are patenting the tools for research. Okay, this didn't used to happen. We used to sort of, patent downstream. We're increasingly patenting upstream. Okay, so science, the methods for science are being patented. People have been talking about this, like Paul David, in terms of sort of coming back to the medieval ages. Okay, so how do we talk about open innovation and closed science, and what is the role of sharing knowledge and the tools for research? That's a big question, and it's not very good what we're seeing out there. And two, this word that we hear all the time, where the word sharing is in it, is risk sharing. Well, if we really are sharing risks, then shouldn't we also share the rewards? And instead, what we have is an increasing socialization of risk and increasing privatization of rewards. We see this, of course, with the big companies like Apple and Google, where every technology behind them that make them produce these smart products, so the algorithm behind Google, funded by the taxpayer, the National Science Foundation, every single technology behind the iPhone, funded by the taxpayer, and then these companies aren't paying much tax back. That's not me saying it, it's on the front page of all the papers. But even more than that, in terms of where are the big companies today that can interact with the smaller companies, and alongside the public sector, which can do the kind of things that Xerox PARC and Bell Labs did in the 50s and 60s, which really was sharing the risks. So companies spending their profits in these new big opportunities, which will in fact benefit the smaller companies which surf on those technologies. So Facebook did not create the internet, it used it in a very smart way. Where will that money come from today as we are increasingly privatizing the rewards and companies are hoarding at record levels and financialized at record levels in terms of things like share buybacks, way surpassing R&D expenditures?
William.
Well, thank you. I play the anchor here, and listening to the other panelists, putting my venture capital entrepreneur hat on, I think that words like open innovation, crowdfunding, crowdsourcing and stuff, for me, has a lot of potential. But let me perhaps change the context a little bit. As a government official, there are issues here that, that I'm discussing and debating in various countries, but especially Japan. Things like, for example, in this world where we have intellectual property and how that's handled and going forward are issues. One good example that I can give you is 3D printers. 3D printers is an industry that's been around but has really been taking off lately because you have designs and ideas that are created by people where the copyright is a little bit gray, and then people building on these ideas and making things, and how that openness and sharing is going to bump into things like copyrights and other laws. And so these will be issues for countries to settle. The other issue about sharing is that if the sharing is reciprocal, that's fine. But I think that there's a lot of asymmetric sharing going on as well, where society does benefit, but perhaps a little bit asymmetric in the sense that, for example, the social networks, Twitter, what you post on Facebook, what you do in your blogs. Many, many companies use this data to whether arbitrage the stock market or sell you better data or market you better things. This may or may not make your life better. This is interesting. There are good uses of this. I know that by using this shared data, and you may not realize you're sharing this, but this shared data and how this is used. One good example in Japan, for example, is there is an English lessons school that uses the Twitter feeds from Japanese to find the bad habits in their grammar and providing lessons on how to optimize certain weird habits that certain segments may have and such. And so this asymmetric sharing, I think, is something that I think will be of issue, and that whether or not you have been doing this knowingly or not is, I think, a valid concern.
That brings up the interesting point about whether what we're seeing now within the sharing economy is oversimplified, because if it is going to morph into something different, and this is relatively new, it's a new model, are we oversimplifying at the way we're looking at it right now, April?
Great question. And actually, I want to zoom out for a moment, because now listening to everyone's comments, which are really helpful and complementary, I do want to note, from my perspective, a clear distinction between the sharing of information, the sharing of risks, the sharing of intellectual property, and then, quite candidly, where I focus, which is the sharing of physical assets, the sharing of things with what we would term idling capacity, the sharing of things that, the car that sits idle 23 hours a day. In my mind, and certainly when I work with companies and governments, there's a very distinct difference between how do we share information, we could call, photo sharing, email, that's all sharing with certain policy implications and so forth. But, and I take a lot of the comments that are made right here, no question. But I'm really looking at all of those assets that are sitting idle, money, value, resources trapped that could be much more efficiently used if we could share them. So cars, office space, homes, those sorts of things. And when you think about that from an economic perspective, typically it's more efficient to share than to own everything outright, better for the environment, lower resource consumption, and, as was pointed out, really good for community building. So that's the space within which I'm working, and I don't intend to necessarily debate the other pieces, because I by and large agree with them, but I think those are very materially different kinds of sharing economies, so to speak. What I'd love to do as well, another term that many of you have probably heard of recently, is called the collaborative economy. And we can, both terms are equally valid, but the collaborative economy I actually find quite useful also because it goes far beyond just consumption or the sharing of physical assets. We're also looking at collaborative production, which, for example, is what William referred to with 3D printing, and what does that kind of liability mean? It also means collaborative finance, so things like crowdfunding, as well as collaborative learning. And these were terms all coined by Rachel Botsman recently, but this gives a much more sort of structured framework within which to look at different economic forces. So what I'm finding is that on one hand, I love the diversity of terms because it shows that we're clearly going through some growing pains around what does all of this mean and what's what, and are we talking apples to oranges? But also gradually we're seeing some frameworks develop that help, on one hand, to simplify what we're looking at, but also explore or expand upon the nuances and the complementarities, and hopefully also identify where some of those really weak spots are, because we collectively haven't figured this out yet, and again are still really early on in terms of tapping into the potential.
Mariana?
Right, so I don't think there's a contrast, actually. I mean, the factor that is most idle across the world today is labor, okay? So how do we think of that issue, which is not just hours worked, it's also the opportunities that people accumulate over their lifetime and can use those to get the kind of jobs that they actually want, which does include how many hours they perhaps want to work, but also the sort of level and the aspirations they might have. And so, with real incomes in the US having been more or less stagnant since the 1980s, if this doesn't interest you, and I'm not saying you, but one who talks about the collaborative economy or the sharing economy, I think that is a problem, so it's best just to admit it. Do we care about it? If we do care about it, then let's try to posit that problem alongside this whole issue about sharing, collaboration, open innovation. And I think there, just as a sort of metaphor or symbol of the problem, let's go back to San Francisco, where you're from. Silicon Valley public schools, okay, used to be good public schools. People, the middle class, upper middle class, sent their kids to the public school system. This is an area which, as we know, received huge amounts of taxpayer support, and that has not been shared in terms of the results of that growth, which produce all these wonderfully high-tech companies from, again, Twitter, Facebook, as well as the less high-profile ones. And the fact that the, if you want, growth that was generated was not then plugged back into the social good, like the public school system. We could also talk about health, but let's just focus now on schools. What do we have to say about that? And if we don't want to talk about that here, I think there's a real problem with this conversation.
Is there a problem, Fred, with this conversation?
Well, the thing is, the resources we have are various. So we can talk about physical assets like cars and houses. We can talk about skills. We can talk about money. We can talk about jobs or people who could do things and who are not employed at this time. All these are really idle resources. The thing is, the way you articulate their coming back into the whole loop of efficiency is different. So there are some articulations we found to share assets like cars and houses or office space, which may not be suited for jobs or for skills or for money to share, where we have to invent other tools. So either we talk about the whole fact that we have assets to share, and those assets are very, very broad in types, or we talk about the way we share each of those assets, and the ways may be different depending on the asset.
William, as the anchor of this conversation, two different viewpoints, and that's what you get wherever you go. It's still a relatively new model. What's your take?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of experimentation that's going on from the shared physical items, for example, cars and such. I think there's an argument to be had that by enabling and directly sharing and connecting the user to the physical asset, that you create efficiencies where people can make a better living. However, converse to that, a lot of vested interests, like existing taxi companies in various countries, feel this threatening. So there's a big sea change there, and people will bring up various arguments of why this is good or this is not good. To the point of education, I think this is also a growing and quickly accelerating field. I point out the massively open online course, or MOOCs as it's known, started by MIT, Harvard, and Stanford. And what this does is it provides the courses that you would normally pay $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 at Harvard for free if you have an internet connection. And one of my stories that really blew me away was I was on a similar panel that talked about this and the benefits of this. And there was a course that was taught at MIT. And there was a student that provided a great answer. And they found out that this student was from Afghanistan, and that this person was a female. This is not a big issue, but this makes news in Japan. And that when they picked her up at Boston Logan Airport, they were amazed that she was 13. And so that what this does in terms of enabling the rest of the world, and that you find issues like 13-year-olds becoming professors and such, this is not only a good thing, but it's also threatening to countries that have rote educational systems. So there's a big sea change.
Sang-Woo, you're in a very unique position
Yes.
on this panel as well. The opinion of, from where you sit, as a multinational,
Yes.
when you view this, how do you view it?
I think the connectivity is getting more and more important, as there are so many opportunities that we could not enjoy before without connectivity. But it means that those kind of benefits can go to everybody in the world fairly and equally. So there are still many areas, and there are many young children who cannot benefit from those benefits of new technologies. How they can listen to the lecture from Harvard without power, without devices. So there are two very important areas where the private sector and public sector cooperate together to solve, which are access and education. So there are still many areas that has no power to charge batteries for that wonderful devices. And there are still a lot of children who don't have access, have a chance to learn about IT skills, which is essential to join the connected society. So as a private company leading the technology industry, we are trying to do a lot of opportunities, not just developing technologies, but also citizenship activities like smart school in 62 countries and solar power internet schools in Africa. So these kind of activities are done by the cooperation between public sector and private sector.
That would become a really key point, right? And this is addressed to anyone who wants to take it on the panel, that geographically we seem to be talking about something that might be either a first world or a developing world problem, but there are so many areas of this world that look at technology very differently. I mean, where water might be a key issue, where food is a key issue. The viewpoint of every single geography, is it very different? Because this panel can probably address that very clearly. William?
Yeah, I think that that dichotomy is obviously very prevalent, and the addressing those is kind of a responsibility to a certain extent for the developed nations. One example, to even share, you need some fundamental technologies to take advantage of the ICT that we've been progressing, so that we've been talking about. And so the assumptions that we're making is based on the underpinning of a lot of the advancements that we have. However, if you look at countries like Africa, they are benefiting to this extent. There's a lot more to do, but a good example, this may not necessarily be sharing, but it enables sharing in other types of commerce, is that up until recently, a lot of African nations, I think the percentage is like 94% of Africans don't have bank accounts. However, due to technology and the advancements in technology, the price of cell phones coming down, they're able to do payments and transactions with each other using a very simple technology, IR, and beaming money to each other. And this has enabled a whole different economy and opportunities for them, which then allows people to then talk about things like sharing. So I think that while there are discrepancies, these technologies that go downstream definitely help enable that quicker.
Come to the issue of finance, which I think is really important. So, I mean, someone mentioned crowdfinancing before, and I mean, there as well, is the point simply to finance something, or is it that we want to restructure financing and get more participation and the collaborative type of financing in order to achieve a certain goal? And I think this is something that really distinguishes countries around the world, and I would put kind of China and Brazil on one side of the famous BRICS, because they're really thinking very hard about how to reform the financial system. So you don't just get more finance, because there's plenty of finance out there. What you want is patient, long-term, committed finance, if what you want is this kind of smart innovation-led growth, which I kind of feel like is in the background of everything we're talking about, right? Because often the word sharing economy, open economy, knowledge economy, collaborative economy has this assumption that somehow this is going to bring more innovation, creativity, dynamism, get out of the status quo. But in order to have innovation, what we know is you need this particular type of financing. Which doesn't have to be just through, for example, how China and Brazil do it, which is through a very active state investment bank. The China Development Bank today is basically funding all these very interesting new companies, both in telecoms. Huawei, #1 in the world, got massive loan from them, $2 billion worth, as well as all the new wind and solar companies coming out of China. And what's interesting about that model, which Brazil also has, is it is actually quite inclusive and sharing in the sense that these particular tools for finance actually are earning quite a bit of money, which then is plugged back into the economy. So the Brazilian Development Bank today has been making something like 21% return on equity for the last 5 to 6 years, and that money goes to the treasury, most of it, something like 80%, which then gets plugged back into favelas, education, healthcare, but the 20% that remains in the bank is used both to fund some of their existing industries, but also to really revolutionize the landscape of innovation in terms of financing those areas that the private financial sector in Brazil is too risk-averse to fund. And so that's just one instrument, but why don't we talk about, in terms of sharing, things like equity from these public financial instruments, income contingent loans, which we do for students. Why don't we do it for companies? So, Google's algorithm funded by the state, why didn't some of those profits go back into something called an innovation fund, which could fund the next opportunities for the innovation economy, the collaborative economy to use? So just to change the way we talk about finance, it's not any kind of finance, it's a particular kind of finance, and does the crowdfunding kind of model, which enters this conversation, really revolutionize that sort of factor? And I don't think it does.
Fred, you've been in that position. When you listen to Mariana, what do you make of it?
Well, I think the model that has been used so far has been to get some finance from the public authorities, and then when the companies are working well, they give back to the state through the taxes. So if it's not working well, then we have to review all this system. But the thing is, all the companies, when they are working, are paying taxes, and when they're not working, they're just dying. So if we think about the whole loop, if this loop is broken, then we have to rethink it, I agree. But if we think that the way it had been done before, by allowing companies to grow inside a structure which is a country, which is owned by the state, then we should agree that when this company is working well, it returns taxes, and it is the way you give back to the original money.
I think it's not working for two reasons. One is the reason which I don't think it's very useful to talk about here, which is, of course, these companies are not paying tax. There's all these loopholes, which, again, it's not me saying it. There's a huge international debate about the degree to which Amazon, Facebook, Apple pay tax. Fine.
System which doesn't work.
No. Yeah, exactly. But let's not even go there, okay? The question is, what has happened to tax, even when it's paid? And in the US, what's fascinating, it was actually many of the heroes of the sharing economy, so the whole venture capital industry, was actually the lobby in 1976 that did what then Piketty is talking about in his book, right? In Piketty's new book, where you see this rate of return on capital completely outpacing the rate of return on growth since basically the mid-70s onwards. The reason that happened was, agents like the National Venture Capital Association started saying, oh, we're the innovators, we're the dynamism, behind the economy. In order to make us invest, reduce our capital gains. And they achieved that in 5 years. Capital gains tax in the US was 40% in 1976. By 1981, it was 20%. And since then, also the details within that tax have been evolving through this kind of narrative of who the innovators are. Second, I don't think the tax system, even if it was a bit of a higher rate with capital gains, or even if we were paying the kind of tax that we had under the communist Eisenhower, right, 90% marginal tax rate, I don't think taxes were meant to do the kind of innovation thing. So Tesla Motors and Solyndra both got $500 million guaranteed loan from the Obama administration. Solyndra goes bust, makes front pages everywhere, the taxpayer loses out. Tesla doesn't. Tesla today is, very successful company. How can the public, and I'm not talking about the state, I'm talking about the taxpayers, benefit from the Tesla investment so the Solyndra investment is covered, that loss, as well as getting money to finance the next round? This is not about socialism versus capitalism. This is in order to make capitalism be as dynamic as it could be, we have to think about these issues. And it's not just about reforming the tax system. It's actually thinking about what is the source of innovation, who the wealth creators are, where does value come from? And the reason I tend to be uncomfortable in these kind of conversations is they're not really challenging that question. Where does wealth come from? Which are the agents? Who are the agents that are actually contributing to it? It's a very narrow discussion.
Sang-Woo, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I agree with Mazukato's comment. And I think it is one of the most important issues that we have to solve to make our the connected society benefit everybody, the financing, and who will pay for those infrastructures, and who will benefit from those infrastructures. That must be fair, and that must be clear. So, as a private company, I would like to say that the basic principle is that it must be fair and clear. And I'm a taxpayer, and our company pays tax in every country.
That's always good to hear.
Thank you. So we established our subsidiary in every country where we do business. In France, we have Samsung Electronics France, and complies with the French tax law. So that is a basic principle. And as a private company, I think there is another way to contribute to the society by sharing our technologies without costing the people. So for example, our Tizen open platform we launched a couple of years ago, where the developers can create apps through that open platform. And in 2013, the developers of apps earned 11.5 billion euros. And the European Commission announced that by 2018, there will be 5 million jobs will be created in European app sector. So that is a kind of way for us to contribute in that problem.
April, you speak to governments, NGOs, private companies. Is this really an us versus them, big established companies versus small startups? Is this situation as split as people make it out to be? Are the opinions as split when you talk to all these parties? Especially when it comes to a new model where people are still trying to figure out the monetization process.
Yeah, great question. And there are, I think, 100 different directions I could take with it. I'm going to speak for a moment. I think it blends some of what I've heard thus far. And I'm trying to come up with ways that we can integrate these learnings, or at least, see them holistically. And I'm going to talk about the role of local government here, because I spend a lot of my time looking at this concept, which you might think of as a shareable city or a shared city, or what does the sharing economy, and here again I'm talking more about the sharing of physical assets, mean to cities? What does it mean to urban planning? When we think about urbanization, and we think about the fact that we are going from 50% of the global population living in cities as of today, by 2030, that's going to be 60%. By 2050, that's going to be 70%. And by 2100, we are going to have 85% of the global population, which is estimated at that point in time to be 10 billion people, living in cities. That's more people than inhabit the entire world today in cities. And we know that right now, the typical growth model, just taking one case, transportation, it's ring roads, it's cars, it's congestion. We know we have a massive CO2 emission issue already. Like, that is just not a sustainable situation, both from an environmental perspective, but then very practically. I'm like, that's just a miserable lifestyle for a lot of people. So what does the sharing economy, and again, sharing of physical assets, using resources more efficiently, what does that mean for cities? And right now, a lot of city leaders, I can say, haven't really heard the term. I mean, some have in more developed markets, but by and large, this is nascent. And on one hand, we can talk about the issues around policy and, well, how would we tax this? How would we regulate that? And of course, you get there. But on day one, a lot of governments are saying, we don't know what we don't know, and we've never heard this before. And you start explaining it to them, and what I can say is, on one hand, I've been extraordinarily pleased and encouraged by the amount of interest that I find within the public sector about learning about this space, tapping into it. Doesn't feel at all like us versus them. I think a lot of what we see in the press is us versus them, largely because, in a different way than William said, but sort of information asymmetries. Oftentimes, governments, 9 times out of 10, when you see a government get involved in the sharing economy, again, in terms of these technology-enabled platforms, it's because a policy is outdated. It's because there's no way really to regulate it, or you can't tell if a law applies or not. It's some kind of clunky, awkward outcome. And usually that makes the government feel like they're a little bit, as we would say, behind the 8 ball. They're a little bit like, we don't know what to do, but we're being called out. Whereas if you actually sit down and just speak with governments about the opportunities that are presented, they do want to figure this out. But there's today no easy way for policymakers and government leaders to learn about what to do. And this is largely uncharted territory. Just one anecdote from a policy perspective, I joke in a way that many of you may know, when the car was first introduced, the laws in many places said, you can drive a car on the street so long as it doesn't go faster than a horse and buggy, and so long as someone in the front is waving a flag in front of the car to make sure that people know that a dangerous moving vehicle is on the road. Now that seems ludicrous to us today, but you can understand why it was the case. When you think about the sharing economy, we're trying to implement and integrate new business models based on sharing or access rather than ownership, but we're inserting them into a regulatory environment that has really been built all for ownership. And we know where liability is, and we know what happens if things go well, and we know what happens if they don't go well. And so that's where, again, it doesn't feel to me like us versus them, but it feels like there are enormous information gaps that collectively we need to start thinking about tackling. And that's, how do we tap into different forms of education and information sharing?
William, when you look at venture capitalists, anyone who's looking at this as an investment, and you see governments confused, you see the fact that in headline news you get names like Uber, Airbnb, lawsuits. How do you then figure out what is a relatively new model? How do you get the funding? Because we can talk a lot about crowdfunding, we can talk about bringing money into the business, but if governments are still unsure, VCs are going to be unsure, aren't they?
Right. So as a VC, you always have the adage that if there's a problem, it's an opportunity. And for example, using your Uber example, that is probably a venture that has the most lawsuits ongoing. I know that they're now in over 100 cities, and I think that they're being sued by each of them. But the point there is it's really, they're taking that as really an inefficiency in a system, a very obvious problem, and flipping that around as an opportunity and educating these government agencies one at a time to what April mentioned, these mindset changes and so on. So as a VC, when it seems reasonable that you could have a chance in changing the mindset of the vested interests, I would think that that's a very good opportunity for investments. It's the crux of disruptive innovation. It's the crux of creating new markets that weren't there. And so I look forward to a lot of those. And countries like Japan, for example, are ripe for changing.
I know Mariana doesn't agree with you because you were supposed to be the anchor.
No. I mean, it's not that I disagree, but these issues are dynamic. They change over time. So VC today, at least I would say in the US and the UK and those unfortunate countries that are copying this model, is very short-termist, right? I mean, it's all about the exit mainly through an IPO, mainly in 3 to 5 years. 5 is already actually quite long-term. It tends to be around 3 years. That funding model, which is very short-termist, it's actually quite speculative, is actually not doing what you just said, which is creating new markets. Okay, to create new markets, you need to think big, you need to think over a long period of time, and it's not going to happen in 3 years. But I actually wanted to say something more towards what April was talking about, which is, of course, many countries do have this problem that public policy, whether it's at the local, regional, or national level, sometimes is sort of a step behind. But if you look over long periods of time, kind of the history of capitalism, what you find is that in some cases, public policy has not just been ahead of the game, but been completely transformational. And why is that? Because every time you have a technological revolution, whether we're talking about, say, the mass production revolution, electricity, the internet, it takes a long time for these revolutions to really get fully deployed throughout the economy. Electricity took about 50 years. IT, we're halfway there. So the question is, how can we actually really think big for local, regional, and national government to really allow the IT revolution to get fully deployed? And there we should look at lessons from the past. So the mass production revolution actually had big thinking, which wasn't necessarily correct or wrong thinking, but big thinking about how to get that fully deployed. And it was through things like suburbanization. And people didn't just wake up and want to go live in the suburbs, right? That was a result of public policy. Carlota Perez has some really important work in this area. And green today is not a technological revolution, and lots of us, the reason you're interested in sharing these cars obviously must have something to do with making the cities and the nations also more sustainable. Green could become not so much a technological revolution, even though it sort of is, but it's especially a potential direction through which the IT revolution gets fully deployed. But that requires big thinking government at all these different levels. We have no framework for that today. We're going completely backward, where at best we talk about the state as fixing different little market failures, when actually these big things in the past required mission-oriented kind of thinking. And today, this is the biggest crisis. We no longer have mission-oriented thinking by governments, which are either told to step aside and let the market to decide the direction, or just to put little bandages here and there, and you'll never get these transformational changes with that little thinking.
Are we that dependent, Fred, on government policy for creating a new model of business?
It depends on the model of business. If we look at our case, BlaBlaCar, what we do is long distance ride sharing, so that drivers who are driving from one city to the next, like 200 or 300 miles, have available seats in their cars, and they're sharing them with passengers who are paying. And this is just sharing costs, and it's not bothering anyone. I mean, so far there's been no issue about what we've been doing, because it's simply sharing costs as if you were sharing the cost with your friends or with your family when you go on holiday or when you go back to your home place.
I think it brings back the question that one of our audience members has asked. It is becoming a government issue, because then they bring up responsibility. And the question is, how should responsibility work for those who enable sharing markets? What responsibility does BlaBlaCar have for its customers?
So far, what happens is that we're building a whole structure of trust in between people who've never met. So we have, I think it's an issue we will bring a lot in the next minutes. But so all about trust, it means that when you're a member, when you register on the website or on the service, you will give some information. You'll have some declarative information, like your picture, your name, your preferences, your bio, and you will say like lots of things about you. Then we will have a moderation step, which is the website checking that all the information you gave are correct, like your mobile phone number or your email. And we check also that the content published on the website is correct, meaning that we moderate all the texts and all the images. We have customer support, which can answer everybody. And then you have ratings, of course, in between members, which build trust in between people who've never met. And we made studies that, so like the ratings are very important, because when you go with a ride with someone, if you know that John was rated by Mary 14 or like 5 stars, and there's been 14 people traveling with John, then your trust goes up and you have a lot of more confidence. And then we have statuses for the members, so you can reach to a member. You start as a beginner and then you finish as an ambassador. And so we bring a lot of trust in between people who've never met. And by doing that, we encourage, of course, the positive behaviors in the system. And it brings the fact that the more you share, the more you build your own trust. And actually, there are some studies right now going on showing that when you enter in a sharing mode, you could become a more trustworthy person in the end. And so this is studies which are going on. I hope we will have the results in the next months. And so I think it all comes back to the interest of users, because we've been talking a lot about what the state should do, what it could do, and what big visions the state should have. I think there are two roles. Sometimes the state and the nations should think way forward and make things so that new things happen. But also, when the market does new things, the role of the state and the authorities is simply to frame it. And if it's in the interest of the end user, if it's in the general interest because people use it and it's good for them, then the role of the authorities is simply to make the frame so that this happens in the best and more trustworthy way, in the more safe way.
William.
Yeah, so I just had to defend the venture capital industry here and rebut my fellow panelists' comments. Honestly, I think that a lot of the sharing economies that you see that have evolved, the Airbnbs and blah, blah cards and so on, the role of venture capital, I think, should be separated from the actual owners of the companies themselves. But I think the venture capitalists are playing a fundamental role in enabling these companies to do what they do. That this is such an unknown area, that we're having this debate as vibrant as we are. The buffer that they provide, I think, is incalculable. And then you create these companies, and we could have a whole different argument here, but we create these companies that provide an enhanced sharing, whether it's the Twitters or the Facebooks. You could share, and while there's an argument to be had on how the corporations then use the data and so on and so forth, the point is, at the end of the day, you have a choice. So if you have a problem with that, you could either complain or not use it. But it is this economy here where there's nothing wrong in a VC to exit and make money and then put that money into something else to further enable this. That's how it works. That I think that a lot of this sharing discussion that we have and the enablement of this is really a lot has to do with the venture capitalists taking that risk. And if you don't like it, then don't use it.
April, is it a wrong thing for people to want to make money? Because isn't that what business is all about?
No, we could spend the whole session on this one
well,
question.
let's address it to this particular business model. Is it wrong for a sharing economy model to make money for the people who take the risk, as William said?
Big picture, no. I want to frame this in my own way, if you will. Being based in the Bay Area, I get steeped in the venture capital, the latest investments, literally dozens of them every day coming out of this space. And I always enjoy the moment I leave San Francisco, and I love it, it's my hometown, but the moment I leave and come anywhere in Europe, many places in Asia, many places in South America, where you're still talking about what kind of capital you're investing in these companies, but there is almost by default a bigger focus on what is the public value, what is the role, what is the social benefit, if you will. And yes, we're talking about how are we going to fund this, but it's not a sort of, not all or nothing, but it's not so skewed towards the role of private traditional venture capital. Fred and I were talking earlier briefly about, I see this, and a lot of my history, my career history has been spent in the space of impact investing, triple bottom line, quadruple bottom line, base of economic pyramid. How do we really make investments that, yes, you're going to get a financial return, but not at all costs. You have to have a social return, or you have to have an environmental return. That's the only way you would also make that investment. And I see this space, by and large, that community hasn't been engaged so much around the sharing economy opportunities. And I see it as this huge, very rich, if you will, rich in terms of impact, space to be explored, and the role for impact social venture funds and so forth to play in this space. They typically have longer time horizons. They're not looking for quick equity exits. They typically do require some kind of social return metrics. They do have a bigger emphasis on green and sustainability, and yet they're not really here yet. So that's one of my missions in the short to medium term, is to engage that community as much as possible. So I think I answered. There was another piece I was going to mention there, but it's okay.
That would interestingly bring up the fact that I just want to come back to a point that I wanted to talk about. Is the perception of sharing then very, very different across the globe? Because the concept of innovation is very different across the globe. It comes back to education. It comes back to the incentives, the risk, the reward. So as you go around the world, does that change? If I can get everyone's opinion very quickly on this. You want to start, William?
Does it change around the world? Yeah, what's interesting about this, so I've been giving examples about venture capital and so on, but it actually doesn't work this way in Japan, for example. The compare and contrast I can only give is perhaps the US and Japan model. And what's interesting about the sharing economy and this concept of sharing, whatever definition it is, I'm actually finding that it tends to be educational based. So how empathy is described, how you help others and so on. And societally, I see that there's actually a direct connection to how you are exposed to this while as early as elementary school. And so I see those changes because being in government, I'm trying to boil down and going, okay, which ministry is at fault here? And so that would be my addition to that.
I think that if you go around the world, it's not so much even the size of the country or the level of income of the country. It does come down to what is sort of the vision of the administration that actually, differentiates many countries. So for example, again, in Brazil, with all the faults that maybe Lula had, something really interesting that he did do, which I think was absolutely inspirational, was he said, we want to do innovation. So we do want to do the whole smart innovation-led growth thing, but we also want to have poverty alleviation. Now, sharing in that context, where the vision of the country is very much those two areas, will be very different from a country that, for example, just says we want to do lots of innovation and get high tech and have our own Silicon Valley, like in the UK, where we call it Silicon Roundabout. Sharing in that context will be different. And it doesn't come down to whether it's BRICS or middle, lower, high-income countries. It comes down to what is the current vision leading the local, regional, sort of national government, and how then that trickles down and allows, through different types of framework conditions, but also specific ways to reap something back for the taxpayers. Can I just say something really quick, which I think is really important, and it's not going to be a rebuttal, I promise. Just the framework in order to think about finance. I think just one really important thing is that there's a feedback. It's not just that different types of companies, like the really small ones versus the large ones, require different types of finance, but what kind of finance they actually receive, what we know is it affects their investment and their innovation patterns. And this is the issue. So, it's just not true that VC has been a big risk taker. In every single sector, from nanotech, internet, biotech, clean tech, today, they come 15 to 20 years late. Let's just admit it. Once you admit it, the whole way of talking about sharing and risk sharing and sharing the rewards changes. The problem is the narrative is not one that is currently admitting that. We are calling some agents the big risk takers, and we just heard it, when actually the facts, if you look at the timeline, is they've not only come in late, but then also been able to do precisely what government hasn't been able to do, which is reap back some of the rewards when you have the few winning investments. Because of course, VC does lose a lot. But the Kleiner-Perkins investment in Genentech more than made up for all the losses they had and funded the next round. It's that kind of change that we need to talk about sharing in a real way.
Samuel, can I get your opinion on, if I can bring you back to a geographical view of this, both in terms of funding and just the view of the business model in itself?
Okay. Well, what I found when I moved to Brussels 4 months ago, it is interesting that the speed of internet is much slower than that in Korea. So I was curious why those developed European countries have such a slower internet than Korea. In Korea, 80% of every home have high-speed internet, and 90% of Korean people have smartphones. But still, I don't know what is the reason. But I guess maybe the regulation or culture, maybe the law system. But it is very clear that every country on the world will eventually solve that difference, because without that infrastructure, we cannot compete in modern world. So as a private company, I also think that we can contribute to solve that differences around the world, varying the geographical area, by developing new technologies, better product, better efficiency at a lower cost. So that's my first impression in Europe.
April, when you look at the US model and when you come to Europe, say Asia, Africa, do you find a big difference?
Yes and no. So on one hand, do we know what sharing is? Yes. I think cultures around the world know what sharing is. And I was going to mention it earlier in the context of development, but there's a lot of places in the world where sharing is what you do every day. You do lots more sharing in a variety of smaller towns in Africa, let's say, and typically you're doing that out of necessity, not out of choice. You're sharing because there's not enough to go around, whether that's sharing of assets or sharing of meals or whatever the case may be. There's a lot that developed markets, quote unquote developed markets, could learn from those situations. And this is one of those things that does keep me up at night when we look at societies that are just starting to enter the emerging middle class, and a lot of people are just being able to own things for the first time, versus being, and what that could mean, the upside of economic growth, but the downside of a lot more resource intensity. And it's not the position of anyone to tell another person what they can and cannot do, but there are real issues around, wouldn't it be great if, kind of like mobile banking leapfrogged traditional brick and mortar banking, we could think about in those areas where you could imagine, especially, let's just take the case again of transportation, in societies where most people don't own cars today, but could, in the next 10 years, a lot of people are going to be able to own cars for the first time, to be able to get to the point where actually being able to tap into a shared fleet of vehicles is equally, if not more, attractive to ownership. So there are those kinds of distinctions between sharing. The biggest challenge, the biggest difference I see really boils down around conceptions of sharing and is this going to work or not, does boil down to trust and does boil down to cultural differences related to trust. So anywhere that there's been, for example, ethnic strife or different minorities not trusting one another, we have a really long way to go. But there are lots of different mechanisms we can think about overcoming some of those trust barriers that go well beyond any particular business model. And the last point I want to call out here, and really it actually has to do with what's happening in South Korea. When we look at this from a government perspective or who's getting behind this space, a lot of times people assume that the sharing capital of the world is San Francisco. And there's a lot going on there, and by all means, it's certainly on the more progressive end of things. But the government of Seoul, South Korea, is the one government in the world that is actually looking at the sharing economy and using it not only as a pillar for their entire urban planning strategy, but to your point around investment, for example, first they've passed legislation, they've committed investment funds, they're co-incubating companies with residents, and the focus, yes, there are companies that are generating some profit out of this, but they're making it really clear that the point of this is not simply financial return. And it's rather extraordinary. So culturally, as a role model for other places, they're blessed with very high levels of digital literacy and access to technology, which helps them a lot. But even with that said, I think the whole world should be looking at Seoul in this regard because there's something going on culturally that they're getting right.
I'd like to make just one quick comment. APU is a member of five advisory committee to the city of Seoul. So thank you for your advising us.
Seoul is the only city in the world to have a committee that's actually looking at the sharing economy.
Do you find that the attitudes are different? For example, if Seoul has a committee, do you find, Fred, that maybe it's not reciprocated around the world in the same way? Are they ahead of us in some way?
Well, I think each country and each situation is different, and all the countries have to deal with their own things and everyday matters, and sometimes they don't have time to focus on the future so much, and they have a lot to do with today already. So it may be an explanation for the differences we may see between cities, like the ones we said, and also regarding the way we learn. Instead of looking at it like geographically, I would like to see the other way of looking at it, the difference between the way we learn today and the way we learned 10 days ago. And the way we will be learning in 10, 20, or 50 years, I think this is going to be totally different. It has begun with all the computer skills. We know that all the people who build actually all the platforms we're talking about, the IT people, most of them have learned a lot by sharing the knowledge through the networks themselves, and they haven't learned what they know through schools or through academic programs. They have learned on the field, and they have learned by looking at all the information that is shared across the networks. And this is a new way of learning based on motivation and game, because it becomes like very fun to learn because you have a lot of projects and demos which are online, and you also have lots of open source projects which learn a lot to the people who are participating in it. And I think this is a whole new way of learning, and this we could look at geographically country by country, but I think we should also look at it by seeing that this the MOOCs that we have briefly talked about, like platforms like Coursera or Udemy, are really totally revolutionary, because they will bring this kind of learning that we've seen working so well in the computer space to all the fields of knowledge, bringing a new motivation, bringing a new way of learning, and also it will bring us back to the fact that the most important thing in education is to learn to learn. It's to learn that the way we will evolve, things will change all our life, and now it's evolving very, very fast. If you want to survive and if you want to stay up to speed with everything that's happening, the only thing you have to learn is to learn. Instead of like learning about the knowledge, because now if you want to know about anything, you just go on Google and you'll find lots of sources about it. And if you know how to do that, you will survive. If you just go through an academic program and remember your classes from 20 years ago, 20 years after, they're almost useless in the contemporary world.
Just say something about learning?
I think April just wanted to pop in.
Quick bridge to that. Great comments. And going back to one of the things I was saying earlier and bridging it with that. So one of the biggest demands, and I suspect there's a diversity of expertise and roles in the room, anyone who's working in government, I don't care at what level, one of the biggest information gaps is how do you enable, again, public sector leaders to learn about this space. And my big vision is actually building on the case of Seoul, and it's true that a handful of cities now have internal committees to learn about this space, but nobody has a global advisory board. That's something I would like to see other cities replicate. But more than that, cities, the best way for them to learn about this space is to connect with other cities, to learn about the experiences, what's working, what's not. There's no one size fits all or one right way to do this. And right now, there's no easy way for that to happen. The information asymmetries are really large, as well as this is new space, so it's all pretty scattered and fragmented. So one of my bigger picture visions is to build a sort of league or network of cities that can learn, a learning platform, if you will, to learn about this space and to connect and share best practices and so forth. So it kind of builds on what Fred was saying.
I actually wanted to give you a question and then let you carry on with your point as well, Marianne. You hear about innovation, the policy push for innovation. Universities that I speak to tell me that it becomes more of a policy push. It never actually happens, and until businesses like Sang-Woo's talks to academics and talks to entrepreneurs like Fred, that's when true innovation happens, and that policymakers should just stay out of it. Is that the true way to educate the population? Have big business, small business, academics all get together, and that's how we get the skill sets we need?
Okay, you want me to answer that and not? Okay. Okay, so what you're describing is systems of innovation, and I'm at SPRU, which is the founder of this concept by Chris Freeman, and the point that Chris made when he came up with this concept of national systems of innovation was precisely to think about that question, because he was writing at a time when Japan was actually spending less than the Soviet Union on R&D, but growing much more. And the question is why? If R&D is so important to innovation, why is Japan growing more than the Soviet Union? And the answer was that they had these horizontal linkages, exactly like the ones that you're describing, between science and industry, also the way that finance was set up, also within companies, much more horizontal less vertical. The problem is that how this has then been translated in European Commission and OECD type policies is all about sort of these horizontal policies, thinking about framework conditions, which of course are important, but alone, they will be pushing on a string. And the real crisis in many countries across, say, the OECD countries is the very low-level business spending on R&D, so bird rates. I was just in Canada talking to the government there, in Norway just last week, and both Canada and Norway have extremely low bird rates. And the question is, how do you increase that? And currently, I think what's stifling the kind of thing that we want, which is innovation-led growth, is this assumption that somehow you just have to incentivize business to do it. So whether it's through patent box policies, R&D tax credits, somehow that's going to make the lion roar. And in fact, what we know from, again, looking just at history, I mean, Korea, Singapore, China, definitely Silicon Valley, is business only sort of steps up and really invests once, when I say the word state, I don't mean big brother. I mean a network of decentralized state institutions has actually really absorbed very high risk and uncertainty. And this is the dilemma today, that because we have such an emptiness and a vacuum of ideas of what it means to have this kind of mission-oriented government willing to be an opportunity creator, which then we know the private sector then steps in, all these R&D tax credits are really just hurting, if anything, government budgets, because there's no additionality. R&D tax credits do not make R&D happen that would not have happened anyway. They tend to only work as sort of icing on the cake in countries like the US, where the National Institutes of Health just in 2012 spent $32 billion in the pharma/biotech knowledge base, and then you get, and this comes to the patent question, which I really wanted to get to because it's the question today. So many of these sort of patent box policies, which companies like Glaxo and Pfizer have been pushing for, it's just been introduced in the UK. It's about to be introduced in this country. It is the stupidest policy ever, because patents are already monopolies. We've taken care of that problem. That incentivizes the spending because you can protect your investment for 17 years. So if you want to increase business R&D spending, you don't target the income generated from the patent. Patents have already done that. You have to target the research that leads to it. And what's happening today with patents, which is incredibly scary, is what I opened up with. We are patenting the tools for research, which is killing learning. Learning is being stifled, especially in developing countries, which often develop their knowledge in these new areas by replicating, in the first instance, say an experiment or something that happened in the developed world. Sorry, they can no longer replicate that because we have patented the tools. This is one of the biggest crises today, and we have to confront it if we want to give any meaning to the word open innovation when we're closing down the learning process.
Would you agree, William?
That's a whole different panel here, I think.
Now let's bring it back to sharing. Let's bring it back to the fact that we need education within these markets to get this model of business to actually grow and become sustainable, for which, as Fred pointed out, you need that education, and they're doing it themselves. Are we then somehow boxing it up with big business, or are we opening it up? Where are we right now?
Yeah, no, so I think that a lot of advancements and innovations are definitely amenable to things like open innovation and such. I think academia provides a key role, and to use the Japanese history where industry, government, and academia work together to focus. This was actually more serendipitous because post-war, the government of Japan had very few resources and they didn't want everybody doing anything and had to focus this. This has actually now become an inhibiting factor for Japan in that academia and to a certain extent industry has become too reliant on government to provide subsidies and help and such. So it's created somewhat of a moral hazard. So I'm of the fact here that when you get into a situation like this, governments should really get and stay out of the way and do this. To add to this point, I think from a sharing economy perspective, and if you look at a country like Japan, it becomes difficult because if you look at the marketplace and how products are sold, you have this distinct U-curve, where on the left side of the U-curve, you have very high-end bespoke products. Bespoke means anti-sharing. It's your bag, it's your product, and so on. And the other side is the mass-produced items. In Japan, it would be the Uniqlo products or clothing and so on that are mass-produced and such. And that what I'm finding is that the people who are in the middle of this U-curve who don't select one or the other side are having a really hard time in competing. And so I think that that's probably that area that is probably more amenable to sharing, but economically it's become very tough for these companies to survive. So picking one side, the bespoke, hence not very shareable, or the other side, which is mass consumer consumables, you get into the situation where, yeah, you have cultures and marketplaces that are become difficult to a certain extent for sharing.
I do want to open it up. We've got about half an hour left in our chat, so bringing in some of the questions from the audience that come back to exactly what we've been talking about. And the first one I wanted to pick up was about big business and talking about our social returns opposed to investment returns, and how do you combine both? And an appropriate place would be to start with big business's opinion on that. Sang-Woo, can I get your opinion on this?
Yes, it is very clear that big global companies make a huge profit from their business, but at the same time, those companies contribute to the society by doing their original fundamental job, which is paying taxes and providing job opportunities, and also making new markets, which did not existed before. And also, we need a lot of cooperations from small companies and to develop the new technologies. It cannot be done by ourselves. So we offer platform and we provide the environment where the small and startups can cooperate with us. So those benefit from the new technologies does not stay just in our company. I believe it goes to everywhere in the society. And to guarantee it works, we need to cooperate to find the best solution, environment, regulation, law system. So it is not just a specific party's job. It is job of all of us.
William, there's another question here which says, what is the public value? Impact investing. What is this a big question mark when you look at the sharing economy model?
It's in a country like Japan, it's still there's a fine line where you don't want to end up creating a moral hazard or a crutch. I think that for whatever you do, sustainability is very important. And when you create certain paradigms and you create certain habits, they're hard to break. And so from my perspective, where I sit in government, I need to be careful in how this is structured so that you can have the expectation that, for example, government or public will always be there and to be of assistance. I think the market economy and businesses and such have an important role to play in terms of sustainability, and then to take this and make this into a business. And I don't know if profit's a bad word here, but a profitable business and so on. So I think that there's that dual distinct role there. But for me, I think up to now, the problem has been opposite, where the wording is a little bit different in Japanese, but I think how that public assistance there is being misinterpreted sometimes.
April, is it being misinterpreted around the world, or is this a situation of just different perceptions of what it should be in terms of a business model?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think going back to the original question too around public good, social return, financial return, those are simply not mutually exclusive. It's not either or. You can get both in varying degrees. And as many people in the audience I'm sure know, one of the biggest challenges today is, well, how do you measure social return? And social return, broadly speaking, for anyone who's new to the term, means anything that has social value. So in addition to being able to create a new product or service, are you able to empower new voices? Are you able to improve education or access to whatever, all kinds of social return metrics? But are you bringing some good that goes above and beyond financial return to yourself and your community? And this has been happening for quite a while, and I think more and more it's almost an overused term, but it's not mutually exclusive. And I think what's really interesting for me is that a lot of sharing economy startups in this space, and again, I'm speaking about sharing of physical assets, by their very nature, there's often some kind of social return. And usually, it's going back to connectedness. It's not as though I become best friends with my neighbor with the person that I share my car with, but I do get to know more people in my community, and I get to understand their broader needs. And what's going on in the community? And what kind of things do we need to be thinking about together? Maybe it's, you know, a park that needs to be updated, or maybe it's that just the connectedness around matching of needs and haves, if you will. That's a form of social return. But a lot of sharing economy companies don't necessarily proactively pitch this. Some do, but it's almost as though there's a conversation that's just waiting to happen there between impact investors and these companies. So it's not mutually exclusive, but I do feel like it's still a very clunky, awkward, almost inefficient conversation at this point.
Fred?
Yeah, on the social return thing, we clearly miss an indicator, and that we could follow, and upon which we could scale and then see if we improved something or not. Also, what we've remarked, I'd just like to come back on this very activity, which is ride sharing, which is the one we do. I was really struck one time after a conference. I just saw someone who came to me and says, "Oh, I've registered on your website 4 months ago, and my life has changed." I was like, "Wow, yes, so, you know, this is the kind of thing you like to hear." And then he explained me that he had a boat in Saint-Nazaire, which is about 300 or 400 kilometers from Paris, and that he goes there every weekend. And he used to go there by himself with 4 seats available because he had 4 children and he had a big car. And then he goes there, and then he said, "Since I found your website, now I publish a trip and I travel with 4 people I've never met before, and the trip is much, much shorter. And I learned a lot of things. I met Natalie, who is a teacher, a yoga teacher in the 18th district in Paris. I met Thierry, who was coming back from his trip in India and who told me everything he had seen. And we've shared so much that now I have new friends in Nantes, which is near Saint-Nazaire, and we do dinners together. And we have my social life has had a reboot. He told me my wife and my children are jealous because I'm 55 and my social life has been rebooted. And now I have new connections with new people I met thanks to your service. And so just for this, I wanted to thank you. And so I don't know if there is any way to measure that. I think it's bringing something good in the life of those people at least. And if we could find a way to measure, I don't know if it's happiness, I don't know if it's a social connectivity, I don't know if it's something else, but if we could invent an indicator, we would be able to improve things against that indicator.
Mariana, you wanted to pop in.
I don't find the word big business to mean much because there's huge differences between businesses within every single sector and also between small businesses. And so the question, and then relating it back to the whole sharing economy, is what are we currently seeing around the world as trends in some areas of big business? And here, this issue that I raised earlier is that in some types of businesses, we have a very problematic business model where it's not that they're making profits. That's fine. This is not about profit envy or all sorts of not very useful ways to talk about that issue. It's about what is done with those profits. We have, as I mentioned, record level hoarding rates, $2 trillion in the US, $1 trillion in Europe. We have record level share buybacks. You ask the companies, why are you spending what the Fortune 500 companies have spent on share buybacks, which is $3 trillion in the last 10 years, lots of money. The answer is, oh, there's no opportunities for investment. And so then you start looking at the biggest share buybackers, which is in oil and pharma, and it's very hard to say there's no opportunities for investment in renewables or life sciences. And so this is the real question, is that if you look then at particular sectors, say like telecommunications, there's huge differences in actually how companies are behaving. And so Huawei and Ericsson, 0 share buybacks. Cisco, 115% of their net income being spent on share buybacks. So the question is also, does that matter? Should we just ignore it? Is it just, everyone does what they want? Or in order to get the kind of inclusive growth that we want, we shouldn't think about big business versus the state, but what kind of market outcomes, and markets are the result of interactions between different types of organizations, business, government, and household organizations. So the question is how to build those kind of organizations, how to get families to be able to invest in things like education, businesses to reinvest their profits in areas like human capital and R&D, government to try to be more mission-oriented, dynamic, and less sort of inertial, and think of it that way, not sort of business versus something else.
So it's not an us versus them game, but it would be easy to be misled that it is in some ways when you look at the pushback from established businesses who might still be learning about the sharing economy. Is that what you sometimes see, William, when you look at the way the perceptions are changing? This is still a nascent idea. It's still changing. The business model, people are learning how to deal with this. Are we judging too quickly and putting labels on too quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even want to touch the whole topic of telling companies what to do and how to do it necessarily.
You shouldn't get any tax.
Well, this is again another panel, but from this perspective, I think there are studies that show that for employees, for example, working at certain companies, they have choices and such, and that there are studies that show that companies who do or become not just a CSR, but more socially responsible in having a workforce that is more interactive, that they tend to do better, and so on. So that feedback loop and when that kicks in and how that does is a business issue. As much as governments should really, I think they're in a poor position to help influence that. Okay, taxes and so on aside, that is a difficult topic. But I think from a getting people to think in those terms, yes, it's very new. However, one of the things that I find it might be generational, and one of the things I do see that is a positive sign is the example of Teach for America. So in the United States, you have a large number, we're talking above 20% of the graduates from, say, Ivy League schools, universities in the United States graduating and turning down offers or pending offers from Goldman Sachs to go through this Teach for America program and spend a year's time in teaching in inner city schools. And what's amazing about this is that they're not sharing for the sake of padding the resumes. It's been shown that 40% of them tend to then stay and continue to teach at these inner city schools and such. But the people who come back, I think that they're incredibly enriched. But talk about that kind of sharing and putting off a Goldman and such. So this is, I don't know if it's a recent phenomenon, but you see more of this happening, and that this is being measured as a good thing.
I wanted to bring up another question, since we are talking essentially at the end of the day about trust. There is a question which I think we can start with you, Fred, because it specifically addresses you, and then broaden it out to maybe the concept of trust and growing this as the next big model. After the trust process, the question comes in, what should blah blah car's liability be in case a customer is affected by the service provided? So you might get to know people, but at the end of the day, a lot of the questions being raised around the world by policymakers is liability. Is this something that the industry has really thought about and addressed?
So we had, there's been the subject around whether this liability or the insurance that you could put on the activity should be across the board for the sharing economy, or it should be really specialized for each activity. Regarding ride sharing, the thing is as soon as you get into the car of a driver, the responsibility and the liability is from the driver's perspective. It's just like if you were a friend or someone from the family getting into the car of this person, and this person has the insurance and the liability and the responsibility of driving you to the other destination. The platforms that we put in place are connectors. They put people in relation. We give all the tools we can to make sure that you encounter all the trusted people in the platform. We make all the tools for each one to build their trust and to build their reputation. And then when you get into the car of the driver is upon his own responsibility on the road.
When you start looking at the legalities of many of these business models, that's when the sharing economy really does run into trouble, because the innovation hasn't happened on that side, which could be why policymakers question you, Airbnb being a great example that everyone loves to throw around. You also have car shares being raised in different parts of the world. The laws are different. How do you then build trust as an industry when this is becoming such a massive deal across the globe? I leave it open to everyone.
Well, that's one thing regarding trust. That's one thing we've came up with. It was a few months ago. We realized that after a few years of iterating on the community, using all the feedbacks from everybody using the platform, we realized that we had built some sort of a model for trust. And this model, we've named this model DREAMS, just like your dreams. And that. So it's an acronym for the fact that the data you want to have access to when you're on the network have to have 6 components. And those 6 components are stated by the acronym DREAMS, which is D for declared, R for rated, E for engaged, A for active, M for moderated, and S for social. So the declared information is everything you say about yourself, your profile, your picture, your name, your preferences, your bio. The rated information is when members rate each other. This brings an addition of trust in the model. The engagement is formalized by the fact that usually the passengers will pay beforehand. So they will pay online, showing their engagement, and then the driver will say, okay, I'll accept you in my car. This is an engagement which is very important for the reliability of simply the fact that the passengers will show up and that the drivers will come and pick up the passenger. Then you have the A for active, which means you want to see on the network if this person was connected on the network like 18 minutes ago or 3 months ago. You also want to know if this person answers to 88% of their requests or only to 6%. This kind of activity is really important for you to build your trust. And then the moderation is all the role of the platform, the checkings and the moderations of the text and the pictures. And the social angle is when you allow each member in the community to connect their profile on BlaBlaCar with their Facebook profile, for example, or any other social platform like this. So this also increases the level of trust. And the studies we've conducted, it was a few months ago, we asked people, what is the level of trust in between 1 and 5 that you give to several kind of people? So what is the level of trust you give to a stranger in the street? This is 2.2. A stranger online, by the way, is 1.9. Out of 5. So it's less than a stranger in the street, because a stranger in the street, at least you have some more information, you've met that person. Then when you ask people, what is the level of trust you give to a Facebook contact? Then you get 3.6. What is the level of trust you give to colleagues? This is 3.8. What is the level of trust you give to members of family or to your friends? This is 4.7. Well, actually, it's a bit higher for the friends than for the family. It's 4.72 for the friends and 4.68.
Well, let's not get technical now.
Yeah. No, but the thing is, it means you choose your friends. You don't choose your family, but we don't enter in this. But it shows in the statistics. That's what's funny. But it's 4.7 for friends and family. And then when we ask to people, what is the level of trust you give to someone in the BlaBlaCar network with a full profile with all the dreams components, then it's 4.2. Which means it's much higher than a colleague, it's much higher than a Facebook contact, and it's almost as much as a friend and family. And it shows that you are able to build trust for a mainstream service if you put all the components in it. And this was the result of the study we conducted a few months ago.
Sang-Woo, you used to be the long arm of the law. You've also looked at the legalities for Samsung across the world. Mm-hmm. Considering how many loopholes you have to go through for every market that you're in, when you look at these new models of trust and the kind of trust building that a company like you has to do you find huge differences, or do you think this is something that you can pick up?
Yeah, I think trust is one of the most important social returns by the connectivity, which cannot be estimated by number or money. And I think the trust is very essential to make the sharing economy successful. And also we can build trust through the connectivity. So I think the BlaBlaCar is a very good example. I like your idea very much. And also, I'd like to give a very simple example from our home country, the city of Seoul. Our city of Seoul opened the web service, which provide all the documents drafted in the city hall by civil servant. And when the civil servant draft the documents to get a confirmation from their seniors, it is automatically uploaded on the web service, so-called open Agora. So I think trust comes from transparency. So this kind of service, sponsored by the connectivity, can improve and boost our trust among the society, and it will be a very valuable asset from connectivity and sharing economy.
April, we've got a lot of questions, and they all come down to trust. So I'm not even going to bother reading them out, because it pretty much says this can take off as a concept if you can fix the trust. What do you think?
I think two main comments right now. I really appreciate both of these. And the Dreams platform, what I really like is we are starting to see some rigor and some quantitative data, and, if you will, a framework, a framing. Call it Dreams, call it, that's just a helpful first step. I always want to go back, though, to the fact that we get so worried about trust, but especially in those cases like ride sharing or sharing your home. Think about it. The person who is sharing this asset has very little reason to do something mischievous. They're driving in the car with you. Why do they want to have an accident? You know, we know that car sharing, vehicles that are in shared use actually have lower accident rates than fully owned cars. There's very little, if any, incentive to do something underhanded. And that kind of always baffles my mind. Like, the challenge becomes when there's a third party that may have some interest in putting their personal interest above those of the people sharing the asset. But the irony is we're disintermediating a lot of those platforms. So more and more, I always like to say, unpack the difference between what is a real risk, which there are real risks. Driving a car is a dangerous activity, not because the car is shared, but because it's a flying hulk of metal. It's a dangerous thing to do. You know, saying that sharing your home or a room in your home is dangerous. Well, you know, staying in a hotel, it's not. People don't actually have, to your point, they don't have the same connection to a hotel room. Hotel rooms are more likely to be damaged than sharing space in someone's home when you know you're going to be reviewed and so on and so forth. So let's unpack the difference between a real risk and a perceived risk. And the perceptions around mistrust I continue to find really intriguing, because sometimes you find there's not really a there. And then the things where there are very real risks and risks to public safety and security, that's when we do want to rethink and relook at policy. The second piece, which is going at a much more macro, almost philosophical level, and forgive me for this, but I just want to point out that in society in general, and I think it happens most of all in the super litigious United States. And I'm also trained as a lawyer, and I've spent many times not in a courtroom, but practicing law and actually working on the investment side to hope to make sure that these deals never ended up in the courtroom. But that we've designed so many of our structures, not just the law and business, but education, entertainment, politics. We've designed our systems from a premise and an assumption of mistrust. You cannot be trusted unless you earn it. If you start by designing a system based on trust, I'm going to trust you until proven otherwise, you design a completely different system. And I'm not saying that you don't have bad apples in the bunch and you need to protect around the edges and so forth, but I find it really interesting and quite sad often to think about how much of our world we've built assuming we can't trust each other. Why is that? Just think for a moment about how your world would be different if we started rejigging and rethinking that concept of trust and the question, what if I trusted you? I think the world would be a better place.
Mariana, William, is this the new normal where we change the way we think about laws, legalities, innovation in the way we just have relationships? Is this beyond just R&D tax credits? Is this about a mindset change?
If I can start. Just listening to that, it was interesting. It opened my eyes to an interesting thought that the trust that we're talking about here in a shared economy is not so different from IT in general. That this thing we talk about, the internet, is not something that came about 10 years ago. This thing has been around for close to 40, 50 years. And what has actually made the internet a useful business tool is trust and enabling that trust. And so as a professional in cryptography and cybersecurity, it's the cybersecurity that enabled creating this trust. And there's a saying in cybersecurity that, if we don't have humans, then we don't need, this cryptography. But the point is that unfortunately, as we know in news in the recent weeks and such, that even cryptography, after 40 years of pounding away, we still can't establish that nice trust. So with that said, from a human being's perspective, and we're still tackling it at a more basic level, establishing that seems to be, I think, a hurdle that we still have to endure for maybe a few more years.
At the risk of sort of sounding repetitive and potentially superficial, I mean, if I just think back to my life, not just as an economist today talking about innovation, but literally the life cycle. I mean, the moment that I learned to trust people the most was actually, living with them through sort of hard times, good times, and coming back to the issue of education. If what we're describing here is completely independent from and not having an effect on things like the way that we think about the public healthcare system, the public transport system, the public education system, then fine. If instead there is a bit of feedback into that, and if the fact, as I mentioned before, in Silicon Valley, the public school system has completely gone down the drain, where most people of our social economic class are not sending their kids to public schools, or if they are, it's in little havens, but the general system, just read the great New Yorker piece on this, what's actually happened to that school system, if that has evolved through a particular type of narrative around the knowledge economy, the open economy, the collaborative economy in that part of the world, then that's where I start to get worried. I mean, do we want to be fostering trust and learning about each other's experiences in cars, or through your middle school experience, your high school experience, eating together in cafeterias, knowing about each other's problems? That whole part is getting worse and worse and worse. And my view is that it's not independent from lots of what's happening here. So the challenge is not to bash, for example, your kind of, startup, which I think is absolutely inspiring. I mean, everything you've said makes me think, wow, how great. It's actually about changing the narrative. It's about making sure that, for example, the whole Airbnb dynamic does not then undermine all the regulations, the social, the health, the economic regulations that have over years through the trade union movement and other movements actually set up, how, say, we think about the hotel and the housing sector. This, and I don't hear the representatives of Airbnb, for example, trying to foster that more symbiotic versus kind of parasitic ecosystem in that space.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've just got about 4 minutes left on this panel, so I wanted to get your closing thoughts and any key points that you make. And if you could keep your remarks quite quick, since we only have 4 minutes and there are about a few. Do you want to start, Fred?
It's always hard to summarize.
Should I pass the baton on the other
yes,
side?
If someone...
We'll come back.
No pressure. So I'm not actually going to do a summary. I'm going to say I love this discussion. I'm just grateful to have this opportunity to share in this kind of setting, because we're able to surface not just new ideas and new distinctions, but also engage a much broader set of perspectives and expertise in the audience than I typically get, which is great. My final thought is actually to add a wrinkle in all of this, which is from a macroeconomic perspective. So think about all of our emphasis, not just on inclusive growth, but economic growth. It's all about the economy. What if I told you that much of the sharing economy, and here again I'm talking about sharing of physical assets, much of the sharing economy doesn't end up in GDP. It's not new production. It's not new consumption. It doesn't necessarily register on those macro levels that a lot of cities and countries use to really define how are we doing, how are we comparing. Yet it can help improve the lives and lifestyles and resilience of residents and of everybody in the ecosystem. We have a very big challenge here to reconcile how we're doing some stuff that's really good for local economies, and it's not showing up in traditional ways. And I think a lot of people here would acknowledge GDP is anything but a comprehensive metric, but we're starting to poke some very real holes in it. And I need help to figure out how to convey that, but also what it means for people who are setting these policies to start thinking more inclusively about what the sharing economy can represent.
April, only got 2 minutes left, so Sangu, very quickly, your final thoughts, please.
I understand there are a lot of issues to be solved yet, but one thing very clear is that we cannot give up the efforts to proceed the better society. Is that my last conclusion?
Just quickly on the macro front, because I think it's very important to make those connections, what I think would be really useful for the future kinds of panels like this is, again, relate it back to our theories of value and their social value. We've mentioned that, but the real problem I find with GDP is how so much of what we include in it is actually rent. It's actually not profits. And that distinction, profits versus rent, depends on your underlying theory of value. And thinking of it more than just the whole shared value way that Michael Porter, I think, has quite usefully reframed the corporate social responsibility debate, but also where does value come from? And because underlying lots of what we've been talking about is innovation, opening up our understanding of who the innovators are and how to produce these more symbiotic ecosystems, which over time will create not only more innovation, but potentially more inclusive growth. I think we have to link that into this discussion about what it is we're actually sharing and where the underlying value has come from.
William?
Yeah, so I go back to my original point that sharing, I think, is different depending on your perspective, and the definition here is a little bit unclear. There's definitely an asymmetry to sharing and what that means and what people gain from that. I think, though, that we need to look at this further because while it sounds nice and good in some senses, you want to avoid the moral hazards. And most importantly, when you do these kind of things, to look at the secondary and tertiary issues that come about through this, because I could think of a few, but I'll leave it at that.
Let's get back to you, Fred.
Yeah, so I'm sorry it took me some time, but I'll be very quick. I'll just say one thing. I'll say share more, learn more.
Short and sweet. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining this panel. Oh, just a quick note. Dr. Mazzucato's new book, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Private versus Public Sector Myths. Remember, it's on so many Book of the Years, so do catch her. She will be in, right now, about 12:15 at the Forum Discovery Lab, talking about the book.